what I want to talk to you about is some of the big ideas as it relates to the legacy of the Han Dynasty, looking at a lot of the innovations and understanding their contribution to Chinese culture, starting early on in the early years of ancient China. So the question we'll ask is, how did the Han Dynasty rise to power? What was happening was there was an emperor prior to the Han Dynasty, known as Emperor Qin, and the people essentially rebelled against the Qin Dynasty for a few different reasons. One, they were pretty brutal in terms of rule following and things like that, and had more of a punitive philosophy in terms of how to govern the people. When the Han Dynasty rose to power, they kind of shifted to more of a Confucian style government where it's more cooperative, where you work together as a community versus more punitive or punish driven. The Han Dynasty lasted a lot longer for many reasons, and we'll talk about some of those things. And really, the legacy of this are the ideas that flourished under the Han Dynasty. And we're talking about things like military technology, which allowed them to expand their empire, the fields of education, art, literature, medicine, industry, and of course, agriculture. The Han Empire, and an empire is country or states under one government. Who they were an ethnic group that now dominates modern China. So they essentially came from a dynastic group that we now see most people in China identifying as. What they were a ruling government that controlled the majority of China at the time, and where they were is they essentially extended west all the way into Central Asia, east into present-day Korea, south into present-day Vietnam. When did this take place? Is from 206 BCE to about 220 CE. And we can figure out how many years that is with a little mathematics. We're talking over 400-year rule, which is pretty impressive. Why did they do it? They were rebelling against the legalist rule of Emperor Qin. And how did they do it? Well, they did have superior military innovations. Their government structure was more desirable, and of course, they promoted cultural development. So you start to take a look at the empire itself here on the map. You can see present-day China, and you can see the extent of the Han Empire during this, and you kind of can see why it covered the territory that it did due to the Tibet Qinghai Plateau. They reached into even the Taklamakan Desert and the Gobi Desert, but essentially the geography protected them quite a bit. And you can see the Great Wall of China outlined on there as well. So one of the things that I want to talk about is their advancements in warfare, which allowed them to be so successful. One of the things that they did was military conscription, and what this is essentially forced military service. Men of age is 25 to 60 had to serve 2 years, and this allowed them to maintain a large fighting force at any given time. One of the big pieces of this is their advances in working iron. So kind of like a blacksmithing and those kinds of things. And some of the advancements were things like fish scale armor, the long sword, weapons like the crossbow, and then of course the kite. And you can kind of see the different pieces here as we take a look at some of these pictures. That would have been a Han soldier, a depiction of a Han soldier from back in the day. And then there's an actual look at the fish scale armor. And then, of course, you've got the longsword, which allowed them to engage with the enemy further away, which protected them from the enemy. And then, of course, we have the crossbow, which allowed them accuracy when shooting projectiles from a long distance. One of the coolest ones is the kites, which allowed them to communicate with other parts of the battlefield, as well as essentially scaring the enemy at night when they would fly these kites over. They would create kind of bamboo whistles that had real eerie noises when they would go up into the sky. Another piece of their success was their system of government. We see that they had a centralized power, which means that there was somebody in charge that everybody else essentially followed. They had those Confucian ideas. This is more, like I say, of a cooperative. You respect your neighbor and a lot of ideas like that. So you can look at more about what Confucianism is about. And then they had this, what we would call a bureaucracy, right? A large organization with rules. So one person at the top has the power, and then trusted people below them carry out the rules. And if you look at it, it's kind of like a triangle. You've got the person at the top that has the centralized power that then delegates down to trusted, we could call them managers of sort, and then it dispenses out to the communities. The way you would get a job, a civil service job, was a little different. It was not based on your social status, but it was based on your knowledge. And there was a really intense, rigorous testing process that people would go through in order to get these civil service jobs. And one of the things that they did was they didn't allow people to work in their hometown. What they didn't want to see is any favoritism towards their friends or family or things like that, so they couldn't work in their hometown. But essentially, every few years, they would have to essentially be evaluated on how well that they're doing, and that would either promote them or demote them, depending on how good of a job they were doing. And this kind of gives you a depiction of what that testing system essentially may have looked like. Then we get into agriculture. A lot of it was a cooperative philosophy in terms of things that they had to do. Not only did farmers grow food for themselves, but whatever excess they had, they would put into the community granary for everybody. Maybe somebody needed food, or maybe they had a smaller crop or something like that. But that's part of that cooperative piece. They also had to give some time to work on the infrastructure, things like roads and canals, things that everyone benefited from. They would have to give a month of their time to help work on those kind of public works projects. And then, of course, they had to build their own homes and do those kinds of things. Some of the inventions and innovations at the time reflect something known as the chain pump. And what this did was this allowed water to flow from the rivers uphill into their fields, which essentially were the terraced type farms. Of course, the iron plow was a huge innovation that allowed for more efficiency. It was more effective than the old wooden plows had been prior. And then, of course, the wheelbarrow, which allowed them to carry more things with less effort. And here we have some pictures. There's the idea of cooperation, everybody working together. And then, of course, we see here it is again with working in the rice fields cooperatively. Then you see some of the infrastructure pieces here, right? You start to notice that they have canals and things like that they essentially all were able to keep up. This is a picture of the chain pump, and what you see there is they would essentially walk on this to keep the pieces moving so that they could get the water uphill to where they needed it. And then we see the iron plow and the way that really helped with the process of sowing seeds and breaking up the ground so that the soil was ready to grow their crops. And then, of course, the wheelbarrow. And you can see that there's a lot of stuff on that wheelbarrow that allows them to carry a lot more than if they had to carry it across on their shoulders. Then we get into industry and engineering. Silk production was, at the time, silk was a very desired product, but it was very time consuming. And there being such a high demand, it was very tough to keep up with that demand. So what they did was, again, they innovated, and what we see is they had a foot-powered machine which allowed them to spin silk at a much higher rate than they had before, right? And what this does is increases production. So here you can see one of the machines that were used, the cocoons that were left behind from the silkworm. They essentially take those apart to create silk threads. And here we see some of the process that they would go through, and again, working cooperatively to make these things happen. But then what we see is the foot pump. This allows for a lot more efficiency. You see the one person being able to produce an incredible amount of silk thread based on this foot-powered mechanism. And the end product here, what we see is the finished product that was so desirable that was being sold far and wide across the Silk Road all the way to the Roman Empire. But nonetheless, you see how beautiful it was and why it was so desirable. Another part that was very important for their culture was the production of salt. Salt was used in preservation of things like meat and vegetables. And what they did was they were able to innovate from their older ways of drying everything out to being able to extract actual salt from the ground. And the way that they would do that, they essentially pulled it from the earth. Like they would drill down, and there would be essentially almost like a straw that would allow the salt to then be extracted from the earth. You start to see the use of salts. Again, there it is for preservation, and then we see how they were able to innovate by using mechanisms to be able to essentially drill down, get the salt, and extract the salt much more efficiently. In the world of art, the invention of paper was incredible. Prior to paper, bamboo and silk were used to essentially write on, but with the invention of paper, it really becomes something that is attainable for everybody. And then the way that they wrote the Chinese characters in their language was something known as calligraphy. They would use particular brushes to write instead of what we think of as pens and pencils. They would use a brush that made it essentially an art form, which is incredibly important to Chinese culture and how they express their ideas and anything else that they need to communicate. This improves communication. It's more accessible to more people, and it's more affordable. And then we see now that it's much more easy to put books together and spread knowledge much more quickly and easily. So this kind of gives you an idea of some of the processes. Essentially, they would use plants. They would break up those plants into a pulp. And what we see then is that they're able to flatten it out and make sheets of paper with that. And then you see the art form of calligraphy used to communicate and write down ideas, stories, and anything else that needs to be recorded. In the world of medicine, what we see is that they were believers in the yin and the yang, that there were positive and negative forces within the body, and the idea is that they needed to be evened out. One of the ways was acupuncture, where they would find pressure points to maintain the balance of the yin and the yang, and also something known as moxibustion, where they would essentially take herbs and leaves and things like that and create something that they would essentially create into a ball and then burn on the skin, which allowed that balance of the yin and the yang. Other things that they were able to do was determine and understand the heartbeat and how listening to it could tell them something about someone's health. Also things like blood circulation, and understanding that the blood flows from the heart throughout the entire body, which was not discovered for another 1,000 years in Europe. So there's a symbol for the yin and the yang. You see the different pressure points for acupuncture. There's a picture of somebody getting moxibustion. And then, of course, you know, the idea that everything flows from the heart. And then, of course, we see the circulation patterns. And these would be some of the sources that we have to help us understand their understanding of the body and how it was treated back in ancient China. Then we get to our scientific discoveries. A lot of astronomers, people that studied the sky, particularly the night sky, and the discovery of things like comets. They understood that the moons, the way the moon shined was a reflection from the sun. And they understood how solar eclipses worked with the Earth moving in between the moon, or the moon moving in between the Earth and the sun to block out the sun. The seismograph, there were catastrophic earthquakes that had happened in ancient China and beyond, and this was able to detect earthquakes, and really even from faraway distances they were able to do that. And then, of course, we have the magnetic compass. They believe that the direction of buildings and graves and things like that held a lot of good luck and protection. And the magnetic compass allowed them to be able to use the Earth's magnetism to continually determine which direction was south and therefore what other directions were there. So you see a picture of some of the recorded information as it relates to astronomy. That is the replica of the earliest seismograph machines, and then, of course, the magnetic compass. So these are some of the things, the contributions that we see with the Han Dynasty. And these are going to be some of the things that you're going to see coming up, and some of the main ideas that you want to remember about this.